Hello and welcome to the Australia Institute's Policy School. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm a research manager here at the Institute, and I'm coming to you today from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I'd like to pay my respects to the custodians and carers for this country who've been here for many, many millennia. Sovereignty was never ceded. As with other episodes of Policy School so far, in this episode, we'll be talking about key issues and the current policy landscape, what the evidence-based research shows, barriers to reforming policy, the most persuasive arguments and key messages, and how to communicate cut-through facts and data to help you change minds. At the end of Policy School, you'll be able to confidently advocate for what needs to be done, explain why it needs to be done, and how we can all work together to achieve a more just, sustainable, and peaceful society. So a few reminders: you can type in questions for Greg using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions too. You can ask questions anytime, you don't have to wait until the end. And please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. Finally, this is a live event and it's being recorded. The video will be available on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. In this episode, we have Greg Jericho talking about how governments can address cost of living issues through policy. Greg Jericho is Chief Economist at the Australia Institute and the Centre for Future Work. You will know him from Twitter, and he's over on Blue Sky now too, where he is Grog's Gamut, and from his Walkley Award-winning journalism. Welcome, Greg.
Hi, Alice. Really good to be here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today to talk about cost of living and what governments can do about it and what we can advocate for. Now, I'm going to, as is always my want, I'm going to have a bit of a PowerPoint slide presentation going. So it's going to have a few graphs, of course, to go through. I'll pop back in, so hopefully you're not always looking at a spreadsheet, a graph all the way through. But what I want to right from the start is, yes, how can governments help with the cost of living, but also a really key thing is it's not just a cost of living crisis. In fact, it's not really a cost of living crisis. It's a real wage living standards crisis. And I'll get to why that's important as we go. Now, for those of you who saw my first policy school on Australia as a low taxing nation, you remember I start off with three things on how to win policy. We got to highlight the issue, explain the problem because the problem isn't always the issue, and then provide a solution. And one of the things under explain the problem that I've added in that wasn't there with the first one was we got to find out who is to blame. That is a crucial thing with cost of living. So let's get into it. So first, the issue. The reason why this is so important is because inflation is a government killer. And we really saw this last week with the US election. This is a little chart from the Financial Times, which is showing all of these dots are basically what was the swing for incumbent governments in elections in any one year. And this is the first year where no incumbent government has around the world received a swing to it in an election since World War II. And it's not a surprise that that has happened given what has been going on in the economy. We know from the exit polls for Kamala Harris and Trump, all voters, their number one concern was that inflation was too high under the Biden-Harris administration. Even if down the bottom, Democrats did a bad job running the economy, was less of a concern than the actual inflation. They really don't care about whether she was too liberal or not liberal enough or standing up to the enemies, or even you see right down the bottom, job growth. That is much less of a concern. Inflation is the government killer. Reason being, even if, for example, we went from 4% unemployment to 5% unemployment, the key thing there to remember is that if that happens, we are just going from 96% of people being employed to 95% of people being employed. So most people aren't actually experiencing job losses, but everyone experiences price rises. Everyone experiences inflation. So it's a really key thing to worry about. So one of the things, as I go back to the slide, inflation is a government killer. And the key thing is, though, it leads to dangerous times. And you saw underneath that it wasn't just, I'll just quickly go back to it, you know, their second biggest concern of immigrants, and then we got transgender issues, and you start getting into those cultural things. When people feel like they're doing it tough, they start then looking for people to blame, and you get people coming along, these right-wing populists like Trump, like, dare I say, someone like a Peter Dutton or other, we've seen in UK and in Europe, far-right groups channeling the anger that is right to be angry, but channeling it into destructive directions. And the reality is we need to confront is that actually people have a good reason to be angry. Living standards have been damaged badly for some. And in Australia, that fall in living standards, and you'll see it in later on when I show you some of the graphs, it has been an unprecedented fall. So there's a reason why people are angry. They're right to be angry. Problem is, right-wing groups are very good at challenging that anger. Progressives need to respond strongly as well, and we can't just respond with business as usual, say, oh, we just need time to get back to where we were. People don't want to go back to where we were, and that might have been one of the problems with the Harris campaign. We're not going back. They were kind of like they didn't like where they were, and going back, actually, if it was going back to where Trump was, they kind of thought that might have been okay because at least it was different. It wasn't going to be, oh, actually, we're just going to go back to the good old days of the early 2000s when major parties acted like we were kind of irrelevant. We need to do something more than business as usual. Now, key thing, let's just talk about the issue, inflation. One thing is it was worldwide. It was not the fault of Anthony Albanese. It wasn't the fault of Joe Biden or anyone. And you can see here, basically, Australia's inflation went up and has come down pretty much at the same pace as it did in the US and in Canada. I could put in Europe there as well. We'd see much the same thing. It has been an international issue. The problem, though, and this is where I go from the differences, the issue is inflation, everything, but the problem is not actually inflation, but cost of living and living standards. And it's a crucial thing, and it's a big mistake we make if we start talking about inflation, because inflation is a wonderful economics thing. I love talking about inflation because I can do all these charts and regressions and have lots of fun. Inflation is about the growth rate of prices. So at the moment, inflation is running at 2.8%. That means prices have gone up 2.8% since this time last year. That's what inflation is. But if you talk about inflation coming down, like it went from 3.5% to 2.8%, you say, oh, great, inflation's coming down. People have no idea what it means. And I say this after, 15 years of writing, 15 years of writing columns, 15 years of writing columns on inflation, various things. People don't understand it. They look at you talking about inflation coming down and they have no idea what it means. And the reason is because inflation is growth of something. It is the growth of prices. What people really care about is prices. And we need to, at the very first instance, stop trying to be economists and stop trying to talk to people like they're economists and they want to understand economics. They don't care about economics. They don't actually care about inflation. They care about how much they are spending in the shops each day. And a good way to look at this is think about, for example, I decided let's just think about sort of what the cost and inflation is of a standard sort of a breakfast. So what I came up with was thinking, okay, in the week you'd need to buy bread, milk, cheese for toast, breakfast cereal for the kids, maybe some eggs, and margarine. And have I actually spelt margarine there? Probably not. Um, and we've actually got the figures from the inflation data. That means we can actually construct the inflation rate of a typical breakfast. And this is what it would look like. And as an economist, I think, oh, wow, what a wonderful graph. That looks so cool. Everyone else is looking at going, I have no idea what's going on there. But also, basically think of it this way. The big orange line is kind of the average inflation of those breakfast products. And an economist will say, what are you worried about? The inflation of breakfast is now back down to about 2.5%. That's pretty good. It was growing at 15% in the end of 2022. It's come right back down. We're back down to where we are. Stop your whining. Everything's good. And that is just a terrible way to go about it, because if you do that, people are not only going to stop listening, they're actually going to start hating what you're saying because they feel like you're out of touch. And to be honest, if you are saying that, you are out of touch. Because here's how I constructed this graph was by actually saying, right, how about we think about the actual cost of those things, the cost of those items, how much you'd actually have to pay for bread, for milk, for cheese, for breakfast cereal, for eggs, for margarine, sort of on a weekly basis. And let's start with, say, September 2021. And using exactly the same figures that helped create that really ugly graph earlier on, but actually put numbers to it, this is what it looks like. It looks like the cost of an average weekly breakfast for, say, a couple or a small family went from $41 a week to now nearly $52 a week. But if you look at the last three, four columns there, you see actually it's pretty flat. It's hardly gone up at all. And the economist in me is saying, yeah, inflation is pretty weak now. Inflation is nothing at all. It's hardly gone up. But every person who votes, every person who's actually understands having to make ends meet is going, what the hell are you talking about? I used to spend 41 bucks. Now I'm nearly having to pay $52, and that's if things are on special. Why are you telling me that inflation is over? My cost of living, the amount it costs things, is much greater. People will remember that they could buy once milk for $2 for 2 liters. They can't do that now. Now, it might have actually been quite a few years ago now that that $2 promotion ended, but they can still remember it. You need to talk about prices with people. You need to acknowledge that that the cost of things has risen. Acknowledge that because it is a reality. Don't try and talk them out of it and saying, oh, yes, but look at the inflation growth. That is a killer to your argument. You have to acknowledge reality. You have to acknowledge the pain. You also have to acknowledge that while this has been going on, their wages have not increased. So here we've got, and I have to apologize here, these figures are slightly wrong. Because we had new wages figures come out yesterday, and I was basing these figures because I had to construct these a bit earlier on a prediction of what was going to happen. And unfortunately, wages did go up by more than were predicted. So that'd be slightly just a little small smidge instead of, say, 11.6, it'd be about 11.5% growth. So what this is a chart showing how much wages and prices have gone up in the past 3 years. And you can see, total wages going up 11.6%. The cost of non-discretionary items are those things you can't avoid paying. They are those things like electricity bills, food, petrol, health costs, education costs, things that you can't say to the bank, can't say to your electricity company, say, yeah, look, I'm not going to actually use electricity this month. So can you not bill? These are things you can't avoid paying. The cost of those went up nearly 18%. So even if your wage has gone up that 12% in the past 3 years, the cost of those essential items have gone up 18%. You've essentially lost 6% of the ability of your wage to pay for those things. And then if you see right at the end, that employee cost of living, that's gone up nearly 22%. The reason why that's gone up more than inflation, everything, is because inflation, the official CPI figures, which if you were saying, hey, what are you worrying about? Inflation's back at 2.8%. Inflation does not include mortgage costs. And that's something that I think people are stunned to hear. Most people don't get that. They think, wait on, why aren't you counting mortgages in my inflation? That's definitely a factor in my cost of living. And it's because the Bureau of Stats doesn't. They changed it back in the 90s. It doesn't. But it is included in the cost of living figures that the Bureau of Stats put out. And that's why the increase in the cost of living is so much greater than actually the increase in inflation. You can see there, 21.8%. So you need to talk about not just the increase in costs, but also the fact that your wages haven't kept up. Those two things together are about living standards. And this is why I say it's not just a cost of living issue, because if we just get inflation down, but we don't get wages growing fast, then we're not actually going to start getting better off. And where it really comes home to roost is when we talk about that cost of living and mortgages. This is why it's important to include mortgage costs, because over the past 3 years, the cost of a mortgage on average has gone up 151%. That is a massive amount. That's why, especially in Australia, because we're all on variable mortgages, when you're talking about cost of living, you've got to talk about interest rates. It's absolutely crucial, and I'll get to the Reserve Bank a little bit later. So, I'm talking about living standards. Living standards are basically how much you can spend with your wages. Okay? How much do you actually have to spend? So, what this chart is essentially saying in March 2021, around then, the average full-time wage was around $90,000. Now, what I've done is taken out income tax from that, which left you with about $70,283. Now, this line here is basically what had happened in the 10 years before then. Basically, if you'd had the average wage and it had increased in line with average wage growth, you would have gone from about having a comparative wage worth around $63,500 to $70,200. Now, this is all in March 2021 dollar terms. So basically, think of this as your wage in March 2021 was the equivalent of 63,500, and by March 2021, it was equivalent of 70,200. So in effect, you could buy $7,000 more of stuff in 2021 than you could in 2011. That's living standards increase. Your living standards are basically increased by about $7,000. Then what happened? Well, we'd had the pandemic. So this is kind of after the pandemic. The pandemic, we've had all the shutdowns and everything. Things are starting to get good, but we're starting to see inflation go, and then we've had the big inflation increase, the big increase in interest rates, and this is the result of where we are right now. And that is basically saying that what took us 10 years to get in living standards was wiped out in 3 years. And essentially, you've lost about $7,000 worth of after-tax income in 3 years. In a sense, what I'm saying, what this graph essentially means, and I'll come back so I can sort of get this through to you. What this graph was saying is that essentially you can buy $7,000 less stuff with your wage than you could 3 years ago. That is a massive, massive drop in living standards. I've been using this type of graph. If you follow my columns on Guardian, you will have seen graphs like this. I kind of think it should be the biggest graph in kind of history, because we have never seen a drop in living standards like this before. Not really since World War II. Even during the 70s, when we had massive inflation, we also had wages growing very fast. That didn't happen here. Massive drop. So if you're out there campaigning, talking to people, and you're hearing about, oh, look, I'm really doing it tough, and you say to them, oh, yeah, but inflation's sort of eased off now. You know, we're the worst is behind us. You're telling someone who has lost $7,000 in a sense in purchasing power that they should stop feeling bad. They have a right to be angry. So now the question comes to, okay, this is a problem. What the hell happened? How did we get this? How did this happen? So let's sort of think about some of the causes. We had a global pandemic. Okay. Nothing anyone could do about that. The pandemic ended, things opened up. Great, everything's back. We can go back to the shops. But there were supply shortages. We had to ship in a lot of stuff from overseas. We import a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff had to go through quarantine if there was any sort of things involved there. Supply shortages do create price increases because there's less stuff to sell, more people want it, so companies are able to raise prices. Then at the same time, Russia decides to invade the Ukraine. What happens there? Gas prices started soaring. That has a flow-on effect to the manufacturing costs of companies that are using electricity and energy that is powered by gas. Also, it wasn't just gas, food prices, because the Ukraine was a big wheat producer, soybean producer, fertilizer products came from a lot of stuff that came out of the Ukraine. So you've got these two real impacts that were able to actually cause prices to legitimately go up. But what happened though was that companies, and it's not just in Australia, companies around the world were like, great. They actually were like, yes, we've got these shocks and we're able to take advantage of them. And that's what they did. They were able to go, everyone's knowing prices are going up because, well, we've just come out of a pandemic. Ukraine's been invaded. People know prices are going up. That means we can take advantage of this to raise our prices by easily to cover our costs, raise our prices to cover more than our costs to increase our profits. And what happened? Their profits did go up, and they went up significantly. Businesses took advantage of bad things. Isabella Weber, I've got a quote there from her. The sudden news of cost shocks, like the onset of a pandemic war, grants companies freedom to coordinate price hikes across the sector because they realize their rivals are going to do the same. And you think about here in Australia, your Coles, your Woolies. Well, Coles knew that Woolies aren't going to undercut them. They're all going to get in on the game. And what we saw was that happen not just here in Australia, but it happened everywhere. But very much in Australia, we saw company profits take up a much greater share of the economy. Now, this graph here, it is a bit nerdy economics. I certainly wouldn't be saying go and show this to people, but it's basically saying what happened. This is essentially the share of national income. What happened during this period from December 19 to June 2023, where we saw the big price changes happen. Corporate profits increased over 2% in terms of the share of national income. Wages, small business earnings went down. Company profits did very well. And we certainly were out there saying this, and we got criticized by the RBA, got criticized by conservative economists who were saying, oh no, it was all mining. And I'm sorry if there are children listening, but bullshit. It was not just mining. This is the profit margin, and I'm sorry, I do have a typo in there. I forgot to fix it. The range should be orange. Very sorry about this. So I'll fix this up when I put out the slides for everyone. The orange lines here are profit margins that are greater than 6%. For the whole, sorry, 5.5%. That's 5.5% across the wholesale trade industry. These are the industries who buy stuff from, from factories, from agricultural areas, from farmers, and then sell it to retailers. Okay, so they made out like bandits over the past 3 years. The inflation time has been great for them. Much greater, higher level of profit margins than they ever had in the 10 years up to the pandemic. Now, you could expect them to make a good profit during the pandemic because, it was a pandemic. Things were going nuts, but they've kept making it. Same with Coles. Look at the profit margins here in 2017 and 2018-19, before the pandemic. 3.9, 3.8%. That was their profit margin. Pandemic comes along, boom, up to 4.95. You can understand that. There was nowhere else to shop. That was, of course, they got to make money. But look what happened. They have kept making that level of profit even once the lockdowns have all gone. And in 23, 24, they actually made 5.2% their biggest profit over all this period. Now, this has just come from their annual reports. We're not making anything up here. We got it from their annual reports. What about Woolies, you say? Yeah, even better. They've gone from 4.7% profit before the pandemic, got that pandemic boost. Now look at it. 2022, 2023, when inflation's going up, their profits are going up. Who's actually setting the prices that we're paying? Coles and Woolies. We don't go into Coles and Woolies and say, actually, I'm here to buy some breakfast. The price of milk, can we haggle? No, they set the prices. The prices are what is our cost of living. That's what drives inflation. It's time to actually call a spade and say, actually, the companies are to blame for inflation. Their profits have gone up across the board. It's not just mining, but let me tell you, it also was mining. Mining did really well. They have done so well over that period where prices were rising up. And everyone's saying, oh, the economists saying, oh, mining profits don't flow through into your cost of living. You're like, have you paid a gas bill recently? What do you think generates electricity? Where do you think that comes from? What about all the even the iron ore and everything that's going over to China that has been made and used for the construction of things that we are then buying back off them. Anything that's steel, anything that's gone into that product, you think they're going to say, oh, look, the Australian iron ore companies are making more profits, but we'll reduce our prices because we want to be nice to Australia. No, they all the costs flow through. So, who is to blame for this? Let's be honest, it was companies. And this is now pretty much universally regarded. America economists, European economists, they all say that this is the case. And suggesting it hasn't happened in Australia is to suggest that Australian CEOs and companies are just somewhat more civically minded than they are in Europe and America. And let's be honest, they're not. Okay. The other problem, the RBA. They looked at inflation going up and said, "Oh no, wages are go wages are going up. There's too much money being spent. It can't be companies. They're not the cause. What we got to do is try and slow the economy. In a sense, the RBA has got one tool in its kit bag. It's a hammer of inflation, interest rates, sorry. And so that's what they did. They raise it, even though anyone else would look at this and go, hang on, it's non-discretionary items that are going up. These are the things that you don't, if you've got a lot of money, you don't suddenly say, you know what, I'm going to use a lot more electricity this week. Or I feel like paying more rent this week because I'm really flush. No, the non-discretionary items are the things that aren't really related to you having more money. Discretionary items, those things like eating out, like going on holidays, like buying clothes, fancy clothes and things. They're the things that go up when you've got a lot of money, and they were the price of those things actually went up by less than the other things that were driven by companies who knew you got no choice. You got to shop. You got to buy this thing. I can raise my prices. No one's going to complain too much because, oh, inflation's going up. So here's the thing, and I'll come back. So I'm not having you. I'm not going to just read out a screen, which is always terrible. But a bit of an economics thing for you, so because people are often wondering why is the Reserve Bank raising interest rates? What do they think about? What they're trying to do is actually take money out of your pocket because you can't avoid paying your mortgage if you got a mortgage. You have to pay it. You can't say to the bank, look, how about we not pay it this month? Just, I'll come back to you in 6 months when I'm feeling better. No, you got to pay it. And so the more you have to pay that mortgage, the less you have to spend on anything else. So it reduces demand for other things, for things that are in the shops that are actually sold to you by people who are employed to sell things to you. And so what happens is business slows in the shops and in services. The owners are going, geez, things are a bit slow this week. I'm going to start cutting back on shifts. I'm going to start actually not employing more people. And the theory is that reduces wage growth and then in turn reduces inflationary pressures. Works wonders if that's what's actually caused inflation. But as we've seen from the graphs, wages did not go up faster than inflation. So how the hell could they be increasing cost of living? Profits don't respond to interest rates. So they were getting about it all the wrong way. But here's the problem. Even if they're doing it for a wrong reason, that doesn't mean it fails. The rate hikes are meant to slow spending. They're meant to hurt, and they did. They've slowed spending. We're not spending much. Economic growth has fallen. You would have seen that GDP per capita, when we strip out population, has been going backwards for nearly 2 years. We probably won't have a technical recession because of the population growth, but it feels like a recession. And unfortunately, they've been stuck in this myth of excess demand. Now, I want to show you, again, a bit of an economic thing, but it's just more for your understanding, not for you to, kind of have to go and feel like you've got to explain to people. So here's a bit of a history lesson. This is the 10 years before the mining boom. This is household consumption per capita. All this is how much on average each person in a household spends every 3 months in real terms. This takes into account inflation. You can see from 1993 to 2003, so coming out of the recession, we got rid of the recession, the recovery, up to the mining, it kind of went up in a pretty straight line. We went from spending about $6,500 a quarter to nearly $9,000 a quarter. Certainly no excess demand there, all going on as you'd expect. Then we had the mining boom. A lot of strong wages growth, a lot of people getting paid more. John Howard was also heading out a lot of tax cuts. We actually were pretty flush. And this is what happened to our spending. You can see it went above the line. We were spending a lot more than you would have expected. So what did the Reserve Bank do? They actually were like, oh, God, excess demand, inflation is rising. Let's do some interest rate rises. And those red crosses are all the interest rate rises that the Reserve Bank did to try and stop us spending so much. It had a little bit of an impact, didn't kill it. What happened was we had the GFC, and that actually was the thing that killed our spending. Then what happened after the GFC? We had a bit of a recovery, and you can see there we got back to kind of where we would have been expected to be. Now, the Reserve Bank at this time was a little bit worried because after a recovery, there's always a chance that you're going to have a bit of a surge and things will get out of control. And so they actually did quite a few interest rate rises, 4 of them in a row there. And it was kind of just trying to get us back to normal. But you can see there right at the very end, that last couple of blue dots, they're starting to sort of go the wrong way. So what did the Reserve Bank do then? A star, that's actually a rate cut. It actually realized, oh, things are slowing down, things aren't good. We better try and help the economy out. So if you look at that graph, you can see, that's what excess demand looks like. Now, let's go to the pandemic. Let's go to where we are now. This was before the 10 years before the pandemic. And one of the things you might notice is that last year before the pandemic, things were kind of going bad. And if you were to go back and read some columns from 2019, there was a lot of talk about, are we going to go into recession? And in fact, what the Reserve Bank was doing, this was in the June and December quarters of 2019, so the last half of 2019, they were cutting rates because they were worried about the fact we weren't spending much. We were starting to stop spending because we were struggling. Don't worry, we're about to really struggle because here comes the pandemic. That's what happened during the COVID lockdowns. Now, it didn't happen like that because we were all suddenly really broke. It happened because we couldn't go and spend anywhere. We were literally unable to spend our money. So there was a big fall. There were some rate cuts there as well, but not much because we were already pretty low. But that's how we were going before the end of the lockdowns. Then we had the recovery. So this took us up to basically the start of 2022. And you can see there we've got back to that trend. We've got back to where you'd expect. Now, if you're the Reserve Bank, you're looking at this and you would be a bit worried because you're going to think, oh, that line's just going to keep on zooming up. And that's not a good thing because that will cause excess demand. So what they did, they raised interest rates. Perfectly reasonable, to be honest. So what happened then for the next 6 months? Our spending went back to kind of the normal level. The Reserve Bank, though, was still a bit worried. So what they do, they raised interest rates a number of times over those 6 months to make sure that we weren't going to go above that line, that things were going to be under control. What happened then? Oh, those interest rates had an impact. We started slowing. Remember in the previous graph where I was showing it started slowing and the Reserve Bank then were like, oh, we better cut rates. So is that happening? Nah. They decided to raise interest rates again. And then what happened? Yeah, no, spending still went down. So what did they decide to do? Yeah, let's raise interest rates again. Then you think, oh my God, that was the next 6 months. Look how far we're starting to go back down again. Now, the good thing is the Reserve Bank actually got some sense into its head. It decided to have 1 quarter off of raising interest rates, but it still decided, yeah, let's raise them again. And what's happened since then, we're now back down there. This is how far we are away from where we should be. This is not a sign of excess demand that we keep hearing from the Reserve Bank. This is a sign of people doing it tough. This is a sign of us actually not spending as much as we were in the past because we are paying bills, because we're paying for our mortgage, and because our wages have gone up much less than inflation and the cost of living. So that's the bad news. That's the horrible news. And if you're ready to think like the fellow staff members who I showed this to, your jaw's probably a bit on the floor at the moment. So gloom, doom, what can we do? We don't want to follow Kamala Harris down the line of losing elections. We want progressive parties to win. We don't want hate and blame of migrants and blame of the government overspending on this because it hasn't been overspending. We've actually had a surplus. That means the government's been taking money out of the economy. So, what is the solution? First, acknowledge the issue. Do not talk about inflation, talk about prices, because as I said, they have got a reason to be angry. Prices have gone up. Don't try and bullshit them and say, don't worry, all under control. Acknowledge the issue. Feel their pain because it is real. Do not please say it is up to the RBA. Oh, inflation will. The RBA is doing what it can, and yes, there's going to be some pain, but it's all. No, the RBA have been part of the problem. They've been treating it like it is our fault, like we've got more money than we have, and we're out there spending like mad. And as I've just shown you, we are not spending like mad. We're hurting. Forget this guff about the RBA being independent. Okay, if you're the Treasury, you might have to worry about what you say. You're probably not the treasurer, although, Jim, if you are here, g'day. Um, that doesn't mean it's beyond criticism. In fact, it actually means you can criticize it because they're independent and they can ignore your criticism if they want. So don't be afraid to actually say, you know what, the Reserve Bank, I think they've done the wrong thing here. And that's why it's actually good that the government has instituted some changes in how the board is going to be organised, how decisions are going to be making, that there's a bit more rigour, that there should be broader voices. We shouldn't just have CEOs and former executives on the RBA board. We need to get actually some voices of workers, whether that is people from unions or whether that is just actually some people who are not on a top 200 company board actually talking. And don't forget to talk about wages. So on wages, whoops, sorry. Just slipped my finger there. Wages. Couple of things we can talk about. Strong minimum wage growth. Really crucial. Got to have that safety net. Think about the US and how terrible its minimum wage is and how people are suffering because of it. Better bargaining. Now, this is where the government has actually been good, really introducing some changes to the bargaining to now enable especially lower income workers to be able to collectively bargain. We need to really talk that up because if you're not talking up these things, a Liberal government could get in and say, actually, we got to get rid of collective bargaining. It's causing a wages breakout. We need to be able to respond to those arguments from Conservatives and say, actually, there ain't no wages breakout. My real wage has fallen 9% in the past 3 years. Funding for childcare and aged care workers. This has been crucial. Great thing the government has been doing. And it just shows governments actually can have an active role in wages, actually providing the funding for childcare workers, for aged care workers who are among the lowest paid, highly gendered occupation, mostly women, underpaid very much. You can do things. Make sure there's never again these public sector wage caps that were limiting wage growth of 2%. That just kept wage growth down, kept our living standards down. Other things the government's brought in, same job, same pay. Really good idea. It seems common sense to me. Mining companies hate it. Gee, have mining companies been struggling over the past 3 years? No, they have been doing very well. They can afford it. They just want to make poor profits. So let's stop buying into that line that we'll hear all the time. And I got to admit, even as an economist, I sometimes feel it myself. Oh, the wage figures will come out, and if they're high, I'm like, oh, that's going to be bad news for interest rates or something. Let's stop buying into this line that wage growth is bad for the economy. Wage growth is good. We should have wage growth. The wage growth at the moment of 3.5% is pretty much bang on around where we should have it. It is not something where the Reserve Bank should be looking, going, oh, it's too high. No, the Reserve Bank should be saying, oh, we're back to where we should be. Let's start cutting rates. We also need to think about not just people who are earning things like a strong safety net with job seeker, raise the rate. God, please, yes. You know, let's not forget those who don't have a job, even though it is a smaller number now than in the past. It's still really crucial. They're still living in poverty. We got to worry about that. So that's that side of the ledger. Now let's think about the other side, the cost side, because that is crucial. We
And
need to.
Greg, we're coming up on 11:45, and
Oh,
there are
okay.
some great questions. So
Yep,
if
I'll be finishing really quickly. Ditch the belief that the only way to lower interest rates is through the only way to lower inflation is interest rates. Governments can lower prices. They did it for childcare. They did it for electricity. Here's, you can see the orange line. Look how much of an impact it had. Don't stop there. There are other things we can do. Price controls. No, it's not communism. We've had wage controls. Why not some price controls? Ditch the belief that the market works perfectly. Prices commission. This is something we need to have. The ACCC doesn't care about prices. They care about collusion and things like that. We need someone who actually can regulate their prices, because Coles and Woolies and others have given up the right to actually be treated as though they are treating us fairly. They're not. Instead of interest rates, let's think about other things like raising superannuation. If you're worried about too much money in the economy, how about you say, bring in a thing where, for regulatory purposes, for 12 months, the superannuation guarantee raises by half a percentage point for 6 months. It actually takes money out of the economy in the same way, but it doesn't take it away from you. You're still going to have it. It's just going to go to your super. You've got a bit less to spend, but you're not losing it. And because more people have super than actually have a mortgage, the pain is spread, and it also means the pain is smaller. Support households during this, support public services. Stop hurting people, actually help people who are feeling pain. Tax these companies who are making profits. Go back to my previous policy school. And always remember, people want action. Be bold. Don't say we're going to do more of the same, but with some tinkering about a code of conduct or something. Be bold. Hear their concerns and know that they're feeling pain, feeling an amazing amount of pain. They want something that is corresponding to that level with action. Think of it that way. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went overboard, over long. Happy to take your questions. Please, let's hear it, Alice. Thank you, everybody. Hope that was some help. Hope it got you energized.
yes, lots of strong reactions in the chat. We have a question from Chris Chaplan saying, could Albanese have halted or even turned around the living standards collapse by boosting tax cuts for median wages at the expense of tax cuts for the wealthy? Or do interest rates simply swamp any fiscal measures?
Yeah, I think on that instance, not the tax cuts probably was not what I'd be thinking of. I would have actually been immediately looking at price caps and saying, sorry, you're not going to be able to raise prices by as much as you can. Also, a lot more subsidies earlier on things like energy costs, really actually having an active role. I think what we need to think of is actually have some policy in place for if we ever have something like this happen again, because the reality is inflation, unfortunately, is back down, or fortunately is back down. So saying, oh, we need massive price caps. Well, prices aren't actually rising fast now. The damage has already been done. What economists like Isabella Weber are arguing, we should have done more to stop that inflation, acknowledge that it was due to company profits. Let's either tax them harder with windfall profits and actually use those revenue to actually help people subsidies or with with actual childcare assistance and things like that. Stop it before it becomes an issue, because tax cuts, as he says, would have been wiped out by interest rate rises.
This one's a bit of a long question, but I think it's worth it. This is from Sharon Crane, who says, I believe there is a cyclical two-step phase of interest rates. One is low interest, get a big loan stage, followed by two, high interest wealth transfer stage, where the poorer people transfer wealth through interest to wealthier people with cash. The wealthy often talk about trickle-down advantages, which don't happen, and decry how the poor always want handouts, but never mention the gush-up advantages of high interest rates, and don't equate that with government-mandated handouts because it comes through banks. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, people need to acknowledge that actually wealth creation was pretty good during the pandemic for a lot of people who were taking advantage of those record low interest rates to build up their assets. That's why we saw asset price boom, house prices went mad. Wealthy people did really well. Wealthy people who had a lot of assets built up their assets. It was, and we've seen this. This is what I also always like pointing out, that big increase in essential items compared to non-discretionary things. People on lower incomes, lower middle incomes, spend a lot more of their income on those essential items because, you got to eat, you got to pay electricity. It's the richer people, to be honest, people like me who are on a higher income who don't have to devote as much of our income on electricity because, if you got one car and you've got to commute a 30 minutes each day, it doesn't matter what your income is, you're paying the same amount of petrol. But if your income is high, it means less of your income is going towards that petrol bill. And so that's why, really, when we're talking about the cost of living, it really killed the um, low income and middle income people. And those interest rates, as the person, forgotten their name, sorry, pointed out, it is very much a transfer of wealth. And it's something that is not talked about too much, or not enough, I should say.
Yeah, and our next question is from Lillian Spencer, who says, Economist John Quiggin says we only need a 4.5-day work week as an effective 10% pay rise. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of ways you can go about it if you want to. You can have a pay rise either through an actual pay rise or fewer hours work for the same pay. It comes to the same thing, so you can certainly do that. John has also, been very good at also just knowing the cost of clamping down on wages. He's a very strong advocate for good wage growth and the ability to bargain. These are extremely important things, and if we just sort of focus on, oh well, we got to do it the same old way, it's very hard to get out of the crux. But I think what we've at least seen from the government this term is really some pretty good stuff on IR. I only wish they were as bold on the rest of their policy agenda as they have been on IR, because there have been some really good benefits for low income workers, especially in the care sector, but also in hospitality, who are now able to collectively bargain. We're not seeing the fruits of that come through completely yet. It does take some time, but you know, some of the things they've done on IR would have got a lot of criticism, but they were able to counter it because people know that the system is so rigged. And I think that boldness is the type of thing that we need. This sense of, actually saying something like, let's have some rent caps during a period of crisis for 12 months. And people go, oh, you can't do that. It's terrible. It's like, well, stuff you. We're going to do it. And it's not going to destroy the world. Um, these things can happen. It's just we've all been sucking into believing that, neoliberalist market will provide is the only way to go. And, I don't know if anyone's tried to catch a flight on Qantas recently, but privatizing Qantas has not exactly led to great super efficiency. So, let's forget thinking that the market is going to provide the solution, because the market actually got us where we are by taking advantage of us with higher profits during periods of crisis.
Hmm. We have a question here from Philip Cornwell saying, Ken Henry gave an interesting presentation on inequality in Australia, blaming the mining boom and its impact on terms of trade for lost jobs and low wages in the manufacturing sector. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, it's a thing often referred to as the Dutch disease. I don't need to tell you why, just a sort of economic history thing. But it's basically a case where because of a big exporting sector that doesn't actually employ a lot of people, raises the costs of everything due to what happens with the exchange rate and various things. And it actually kind of made manufacturing in Australia less profitable because the value of our dollar went up because we're exporting so much. And so selling our cars and things overseas became more expensive. It became more expensive to buy Australian manufactured goods purely because of what was happening from the mining sector. And that was one of the reasons why uh, the whole mining tax back in the Rudd Gillard years was proposed because it was like, these industries are actually hurting everyone else. Let's tax their profits and use that to assist other industries, to be able to subsidize industries during this period, to be able to help people whose costs are rising and things like that. Unfortunately, the miners realized what was going on. They wanted their profits. They didn't care about manufacturing. And weirdly, the Business Council of Australia, who supposedly represent non-mining businesses went along for the ride. It was quite a bizarre corporate moment in our history.
Mm.
And
Uh,
I should say we're kind of seeing a little bit of that with, what's happening with gas companies. If we were actually taxing them properly, we could think about maybe lowering slightly the corporate tax rate for everybody. But when you're not getting much from your biggest export earners, it's, hard to deliver any benefits for everyone else.
mm. There are some questions and comments in the chat that I think relate to your earlier policy school. So I would recommend, if people haven't seen Greg's first policy school episode, you can find it on YouTube or on our website. Uh, just a question asking you to expand a little bit more about the idea of compulsory savings. Anastasia Davey asks, would compulsory savings linked to earnings be a better/fairer tool than interest rates to manage inflation?
Yeah, this is pretty much what I was talking about when I was talking about superannuation, because we do have compulsory savings. It's superannuation. It's done for a public benefit because it is good to have people having money to retire. And unfortunately, as I pointed out in that previous policy school, we have so many tax discounts for very wealthy people. So it's not working as expected. But again, think about what an interest rate rise is meant to do. It's meant to make people have less money to spend in shops. What does increasing temporarily the superannuation guarantee do? It takes money out of your income and forces it to be saved for later. So you can't access it, you can't spend it. And that means you've got less money to spend than you otherwise would have because you're not going to get a wage rise that's going to account for that for 6 months or a year. That's not how it would work. Um, but because you've got everybody who earns super being forced to pay that increase in or be forced to save that money, that means you actually don't have to raise it by much compared to how much the Reserve Bank has had to raise interest rates. And what it means is interest rate rises hurt people with mortgages and especially hurt younger homeowners who have just taken out mortgages. They hurt them a lot more than they do older people who have paid off their home or don't have too much to pay off. And so it's a really blunt instrument that is also sharp at the people it affects. Whereas compulsory savings, changing something like the superannuation guarantee temporarily, sort of spreads the pain out but makes it limited. And also it's like, well, okay, yes, they're taking my wage out now, but I'm not losing that money. It's just gone into my super and I will get it when I retire. And so long as it's just a temporary thing, it's a way to do it. Now, the government would actually have to legislate this. I would suggest you'd want to change the legislation so it can be done by regulation. And, of course, there's political penalties for it. People are going to feel angry about it. But I tell you what, history shows Australians hate interest rate rises as well. So if you're able to say we're doing this because it's going to mean interest rates don't go up as much, you're not losing your money. We're just cooling down the economy. It's just for 6 months during this period. I think that's something that can be done. And also, it's a case of let's think outside the box. Let's not fall back into this thing of, oh, the Reserve Bank knows best. I don't think the Reserve Bank knows best, because I look at what's happening with how we're spending. The Reserve Bank's got it completely wrong. Yeah. And I'm certainly not saying it should have been done this time, because excess demand wasn't a problem. We didn't have too much money. What the government should have been doing is looking at this going, this is all due to companies. This is all due to supply side issues. We'll help you out during this period of crisis, either by putting in some caps, or we're going to subsidize your energy costs, or we're going to subsidize your childcare costs, or something like that, because it's not your fault, but you're the ones who are getting the blame. Oh, I can't hear you, Alice. You're on mute.
It would be helpful if I took myself off mute. Thanks, Greg. We've run out of time, I'm afraid, but there were so many excellent questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. And if you're fired up like Greg, then please share this episode with your friends, family, colleagues. We look forward to seeing you next time at our webinar on the 28th of November. We'll be discussing fossil fuel subsidies with Research Director Rod Campbell. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube to catch all of our webinars. You can also subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. And our first book from Australia Institute Press, What's the Big Idea, is available now for pre-order. You can find it on our website. Thanks so much for coming. We'll see you next time.
And before we go, Alice, just a reminder, I will be putting up these PowerPoint slides up on our website so everyone can access them and share them around as you see fit. But on that, thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.